let's be honest. If you're a Second World War, what's the word I'm looking for? Aficionado. It sounds so strange to say you're a Second World War buff or something. But I mean, there is so much violence and so much disaster from the strategic bombing campaigns and everything else that it all sort of blends together. But had there been a nuclear weapon used in 1958, for example, with color photos, and I feel like the object, I mean, it's almost like a generation has to almost learn these things over and over, or we forget them. Um, I don't know
I
that
think
there's a question there, gentlemen, but maybe pick up from where I
I
left
think there
off.
are actually two different issues there. So one is our fear of nuclear weapons, but the other one, which I don't think is the question you're asking, but I think is just as interesting actually, is about the way in which, as a society, we regard moving color images as so close to us. So we say, look at the Beatles in the Peter Jackson documentary; they look just like us.
Yes, they
They,
do.
you know, and then we look at people from the Second World War and we say, they look ridiculous. They're wearing old-fashioned clothes. They're moving jerkily in the black and white footage, and so on. And I do think you're absolutely right that black and white footage and black and white still pictures act as a kind of barrier to our empathy, maybe, because we just think old people from history, so they don't kind of count in the same way that people do now. Having said that, to return to your real point, I think in a way your question is too kind to human nature, because you're basically saying if we had incredibly picture perfect imagery of the effects of a nuclear bomb, we would learn, we would be chastened, we'd be horrified, and we would mend our ways in some way. But we had color imagery of the effects of bombing in Vietnam, let's say, or so many wars since then, so many atrocities, and human beings haven't changed. People have carried on fighting wars and disgracing themselves in various ways. So I don't actually think, even if it was in color, even if it was so vivid and palpable, I don't think we would change.
I, I mean, I think that, say, I don't know, America and China and Russia each had 10 nuclear missiles. The likelihood is that they would use them, because it wouldn't mean the end of them as countries, and it wouldn't mean the end of human civilization. The reason that we were all terrified of nuclear war and we lived in its shadow was that it wasn't because we'd seen the horror inflicted on Hiroshima. I mean, just as much horror was inflicted on Dresden or Hamburg or Tokyo or whatever. Um, it was the knowledge that human civilization would be destroyed and perhaps life on Earth would be destroyed. And that hard core of scientific knowledge was then played upon by filmmakers and science fiction writers in ways that, because it was rooted in reality, certainly gave me nightmares, and I think gave an entire generation nightmares. So you had The Day After in the United States.
Yes.
We had a series in Britain called Threads, and the impact of this was terrifying. And I remember a science film of exactly the kind that you were describing, that was themed around what would happen if a nuclear bomb went off over St. Paul's. And I must have been about 10 when this went out, and I still remember that they wanted to show what the impact of flying glass would be, and they put a pumpkin on a stick and then sent the flying glass, and the pumpkin was completely lacerated. Couldn't sleep after that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then at the end of Threads, which tells the story of a nuclear war that destroys Britain, it showed the heroine, the woman who we'd been following. She gets raped and she gives birth to a child, and the last still is her looking down to see what she's born, and she's screaming with horror. And that was the thing note that the film ended on. That absolutely stays with me, and it means that the very notion of nuclear war is a shadow that hangs over me to this day. I think that the interesting contrast is, say, with global warming or climate change, which is often described as the equivalent challenge facing people the generations younger than ours. The problem with that is, firstly, that the science is less absolutely grounded. And secondly, that you can't sum it up with a kind of image of, a pumpkin being smashed to pieces by glass, or a pregnant woman looking down and seeing that she's given birth to some monstrosity. It doesn't lend itself to images of that horror, even though in the long run, I don't know, I'm not a climate scientist, the results may be may be analogous. So I think that when you said that we need to kind of re-educate ourselves about nuclear weapons, I think you're right, because essentially for 30 years now, the world has been able to assume that it won't happen. And part of what happened with Ukraine, and part of what is a kind of, it's like the first onset of a migraine with Taiwan, is the possibility that we might be plunged back into the kind of scenarios that gave rise to those terrifying films in which the world
Isn't it
is
interesting though,
destroyed.
Tom, that those films, I mean, they're about us as the victims, right? And I think what held the world back. So I think that's an excellent point about if they'd only had a few nuclear weapons, they'd have used them. And I think the reason is because what deterred nuclear war was not the fear of inflicting terrible, atrocities and damage, but it was the fear of incurring
What happened
them.
to us?
Yeah, what happened to us? It wasn't. If I would say human history shows that if people are presented with an opportunity to inflict a horrendous horror on their competitors, they will by and large take it. It's the fear of incurring that held the superpowers back in the Cold War.
Let me throw an angle in there too that makes it, if not unique, then very unusual in military history. You don't have to be a belligerent to be a victim in the nuclear conflict, right? In other words, if
Right.
you're India and you're going to be, you're not going to be involved in this war, for example, it doesn't matter. In a full-on nuclear exchange, people in India are going to suffer also. It's almost like all of a sudden real war, total war, as we used to call it, is something that involves everyone now, and so I mean it's a fascinating way of looking at something that's been a human construct since civilization first arose, right? I'm going to fight you, but now if I fight you, maybe you could say that the person right over the border is going to be affected because refugees might stream over the border, but now you're going to be involving everyone um, in your personal sort of conflict in a way that, I mean, there is no neutrals, right? I
Right.
remember I remember reading about years ago, but I mean, the polluted milk in Scandinavia from radiation. I mean, you start to realize, okay, all of a sudden, if we want to use all the weapons that are in our arsenal, it's going to involve people that are not part of the conflict at all. What did Bertrand Russell say? He talked about that it was unreasonable for man to expect to walk a tightrope. You could walk a tightrope for a certain period of time, but it was unreasonable to expect you to be able to do it forever. And I feel like, to piggyback up on what Tom had said, we've almost forgotten that we're walking on that tightrope. And it takes something like a Ukraine and nuclear powers being angry with each other to potentially remind us that we're still on that tightrope, and it's just as dangerous as it's always been, if not more.
Well, I mean, I think that obviously having your city pulverized is an utter horror, but a deeper horror is to imagine that it's permanently poisoned. So that's what you have with Chernobyl. You see, it's happened decades and decades ago, but people are going in there now in the war, and they're dying from going there. And the idea that the whole world would be poisoned in that way, I think, adds an extra dimension of terror. And then in the 80s, scientists both in the Soviet Union and in the West combined on a paper to argue of what was called a nuclear winter. The idea that so much debris would be thrown up that the sun would be blotted out, and therefore, even if radioactivity weren't completely lethal to life on Earth, the sunlight would go, and without sun, crops would die, and people would starve to death, and the whole world would starve to death. And I remember that the scientists that presented that paper, they chose a poem by Byron and a translation of it by Pushkin to put at the head of the paper. And Byron's poem, he wrote it in 1816, which was the year without a summer, the same year that gave rise to Frankenstein, the story of Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein.
There's a big
I mean,
volcano in that year, right?
that's right. Well, it was the year before, I think, and it kind of spewed it up, and so the sun was blotted out. And actually, it was the last time of mass famine in Europe. Um, but in Byron's image, everything just goes dark. And the theme of it is that no one is responsible. No one's to blame for it. It's just a curse that happens. And the last thing is two people discover some wood, they set light to it, they realize they hate each other, they kill each other. And that's the cheery note on which it ends.
The one thing we do know, interestingly though, is that these kind of things did have an effect on policymakers. So we know, for example, that Ronald Reagan was really interested in things like the day after. He was strongly affected by them. He was personally had a horror of nuclear weapons. I mean, the irony is that all the time, his critics were sort of calling him a gun-toting cowboy and stuff who was poised to start World War III. But we know now that Reagan read a lot of this stuff, that he was really interested in the day after, and profoundly affected by all of this. So a responsible, these, I guess that bears out your point, Dan, that these reminders, if you like, whether they be scientific reminders or fictional, kind of science fictional reminders, they mattered during the Cold War, and they helped to instill, I guess you would say, a kind of responsibility and restraint.
Let me explain for
among
people who maybe
policymakers.
don't know what we're talking about. We're old enough to remember that the day after was a movie, right? The day after, at middle
Yeah.
1980s, it came out, and the day after was a dramatization of what would happen in a nuclear war. And the story is, and I'm not sure it's true, but I've read it in several different memoirs, was that Ronald Reagan used to have movies screened in the White House, and they screened this movie for him, and he was profoundly affected by it in a way. Look, this is a man who had studied, I mean, he should have understood without having to see the movie, but the movie made all the difference. And supposedly the story is that this led to him taking Mikhail Gorbachev aside for a private conversation during a summit, which led to one could argue that there were a lot of dominoes starting to tumble right then that created a lot of the world we live in right now. And wouldn't that be amazing if you were the filmmaker that made The Day After, if you could somehow tie your artistic decisions into something as monumental as that?
And there's another element to that, which is that some of your listeners may know about the Able Archer.
Oh, yes. The
war
near miss.
scare.
Yeah.
The near miss. So there was a NATO war game. I think it was in the Low Countries, and the Kremlin were very worried that this was actually the prelude to war, because their own war games envisaged that NATO would strike during a war game. So they got in a terrible sort of state about it. I think it's Oleg Gordievsky, the
man who saved the world, right?
Right, who passes the story to his British handlers, and it finds its way to the White House. And when Reagan heard this, he was really struck and astonished, because, of course, up to that point, Reagan had thought of the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and he'd thought, these guys are the villains. They're out to kind of, they're part of the great conspiracy of international communism. And for the he sort of, I think he writes it in his diary or in his journal or something. For the first time, he thinks they're just frightened old men, and he's stunned by the idea that they think the West would strike them first. And I think it's such an interesting, it had never occurred to him before that the Russians were as frightened of being nuked by him as he was by them.
Because to be afraid of nuclear war, you've got to think that someone who has his finger on the nuclear button would press it. And that requires you to think quite dark thoughts about people who may be your enemies. And I think that people both in the West and in the Soviet Union did think that about their adversaries. And, as Dominic says, that was a crucial part in opening Reagan to the notion that perhaps the evil empire wasn't so evil. But I also think that is one of the reasons why people are so unsettled by what's happening in Ukraine now, is that Putin has the look of Dr. Evil about him. And he has the kind of sheen of a supervillain in the kind of film where the villain is threatening the world with nuclear blackmail. And the fact that Russian propaganda has made play with that, has kind of hinted at devastating responses, kind of breaks a taboo, because actually, even the idea that you would threaten first use was something that both sides, I think, is that right, Dominic, avoided during the Cold War?
Both sides always claimed.
Either side was doing that. Of course, it's a slight difference, isn't there? Because Putin presumably is talking about tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, so he's not talking about incinerating.
Although
New
his
York.
TV networks, they
they're really.
I mean,
going
their
for this,
stuff.
aren't
This
they?
has got a huge airplay down in Britain because there's a whole fascinating subject here about how the Russians, actually rather like the Iranians, they take the attitude that Britain is the real villain and it goes back to the 19th century.
Boy, it
They
sure
think
does. The
Britain,
Great Game and all that
the
stuff.
Great
right?
Game.
Yeah.
Britain is the real villain, and Uncle Sam is the sort of rich, naive, sort of cat's paw for the British royal family, the Bank of England, and the other sinister conspirators who are really plotting to destroy Russia or whatever. And so
So for them, we are the Bond villains.
yeah, right. And so
You're the
their
baddies,
images,
right?
their images. I mean, they show again and again images of nuclear weapons destroying Britain. I mean, there's so much so that they had a protest from the Irish Foreign Ministry because those missiles also showed them blowing up Ireland.
Well, they had
And
they had that classic British, the classic Bond villain thing where they were going to detonate a nuclear missile in the Atlantic, and a tsunami
right.
would wash over both Britain and Ireland.
You know what's interesting though, guys, is that all it would take was for someone like Vladimir Putin to use a nuclear weapon in an out of the way place in the middle of nowhere, blow up some factory and the taboo would be broken. And I mean, I believe that when we talk about needing a reminder, and we were talking about how long it's been since these weapons were used, there's this sense that, okay, well, no one would really use one. And I think something like that would I don't mean to put ideas into someone's head, but certainly the ideas are already there. Something like that would be a game changer because it would literally be the way of saying, you think this could never happen. We're going to show you that we're serious. It's funny because after the Soviet Union fell, because you'd mentioned Able Archer, but I mean, the last time we almost had a disaster was during the Boris Yeltsin era, where there was a mistake, right? Where somebody had misread radar or something. And you turn around and you go, okay, when I was, I don't know, a television news guy in my 20s, that's how we thought a nuclear war might happen, right? No one would obviously go and declare the Third World War. But these things, I mean, there's a great book called The Dead Hand, which is about the Soviet system that was in place in case their entire command and control structure were wiped out. It could still launch a retaliatory strike. And I think during the Yeltsin era, we thought, okay, the only way this is going to happen now is because of a mistake. And now we're back where we were 40 years ago, where you can actually envision someone like Putin saying, okay, I'm going to use a nuclear weapon in the middle of nowhere just to show everybody that they're out there, we can use them, and you're not safe from them.
But well, I mean, to be positive, just to be cheery for a bit.
that is not what
we're
we
a
do
bit of a
here.
downer. A bit of a downer. I mean, he's hinted at that, and this is clearly what he's brilliant at, is making people's flesh creep and menaces. It's kind of mafia type intimidation of shop owners or whatever. I mean, he's very.
Do you mean
very
the British as shop owners? Is that what the nation of shopkeepers? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I mean, he's kind of it would be awful if you did something and I had to do something terrible in response without actually saying what the terrible thing is.
Nice country you have here. Be a shame if something happened to it. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. But actually, there have been a kind of number of dogs that haven't barked in the night. So obviously, the use of a tactical nuclear missile, battlefield nuclear missile, is one of them. But also, and I don't know whether this is because our cybersecurity is so good or because actually Russian cyber attacks aren't as good as we'd thought they were, but there haven't been kind of devastating attacks on Western cyber infrastructure. And you'd thought that perhaps there might be, certainly at kind of defense institutions or whatever. And that is a kind of the raft of hope that I cling to.
Yeah. There's a reassuring element of shambles about the. But I guess you could say though, Dan, that's actually not reassuring because it's out of incompetence and chaos that mistakes are made and accidents happen.
Yes.
So I suppose you can see that two ways. Will a nuclear war start because a Dr. Evil thinks it's in their interests, or will it start because people are in a complete mess? They're frightened. Everything's falling apart around their ears. I mean, that's probably the more likely scenario, isn't it? Than a villain starting, Bond villain starting a world war.
I think the implication of the fact that these kind of horror options haven't been taken up, I suspect must be because there are channels of communication that remain open between the Kremlin and the White House, between the Pentagon and the Russian military establishment. And it must have been intimated on both sides that there are red lines beyond which you shouldn't go.
But
And
you guys know
probably
better than
with
anyone.
sufficient.
You know that sometimes dynamics get ahead of decision making. I mean, that's the whole First World War idea. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and which brings me back, not to change subjects radically, but we called the series that we did on the First World War "Blueprint for Armageddon" because it was as Gwen Dyer, the military historian, had said, the entrance into the idea of total war that makes the Second World War possible and the kinds of conversations we're having now possible. Can I shift and ask you guys another question similar to the one we did about the Romans and the Normans in 1066? But I want to ask you your views on First World War Germany versus Second World War Germany. And I had made the statement once that I thought, relative to the other powers involved, that the First World War German state was the stronger or more dangerous foe than the Second World War one. Now, in the United States, there's a fascination with the Second World War, the Nazi state. The technology is enticing and entrancing and all those kinds of things. But it was my position that the First World War was the more stable society, the more deep society with the stronger foundation. Do you folks have any views on that? Maybe you differ from each other. I don't know.
I totally agree with you, Dan. So I'm a complete heretic on this because, as I think we discussed when you came on our podcast, I think Britain should have fought on the other side in the First World War.
Did you really?
Which is not a view you'll often
No.
I'm a great fan of, I like a Central European.
Those damn Belgians were asking for invasion.
Right. This was our chance, to deal with the French once and for all, and we blew it. Anyway, listen, I think